It is now my pleasure to introduce this first panel, in particular because it features old and new friends, students and mentors, all engaging with Ms. Shange's diverse body of work in critical and creative ways. I feel like I have an incredible crew here that I'm so proud to bring to you. This panel, From Analphabetic to Script Obsessed, is named after the first essay in Ms. Shange's recent volume of essays, Lost in Language and Sound, or How I Found My Way to the Arts. And you can buy that book outside, the book display. Functioning as a manifesto, an aesthetic autobiography, and a note to self, the essay begins. Like most people of color, Black people in the New World, I came by my passion for literature in a circuitous way, a night journey, marked by music, movement, improvisation, and smells of perfume, sweat, and humid star-flickering nights. I pay tribute and homage to first to the wondrous miracle of language on an African's tongue. So first, the voices of my people made me want to have the sounds forever, to rid my world of silence, the prohibited, the stiff, and the mendacious. She continues later on in the essay. Later on, I sought out language that somehow echoed inarticulate, inchoate impulses I lived with, in the same way that I watched Carmen de Lavalande's body make sense of an irrational, vicious place I was supposed to pledge allegiance to every day. I confused Pearl Primus, Catherine Dunham, and Eartha Kitt, defying the limitation of the body and the English language with an art that was rightfully mine, an art I could claim, from which I could spring like Jesse Owens at the starting line. This panel will honor the relationality of words and movement, the not strictly literate to that which is not only said, but impressed upon and into paper. It will honor the many languages Ms. Shange speaks and the multiple audiences for whom she writes and makes meaning. Supremely attentive to the words on an African's tongue, and the way in which a Black person can begin a sentence with a word and end it with a gesture. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Vanessa K. Valdés, Jennifer DeVere Brody, and Farah J. Griffin constitute the starting line for the Worlds of Ntozake Shange Conference. Alexis, proud Barnard alumna and the Black feminist love evangelist, will begin with a paper entitled Indigo Generations, Consorting with Spirits, Interpreting Dreams, and Accessing the Moon. She will be followed by Vanessa K. Valdés, who will be speaking on Celebrating Our Fullest Selves, the Diasporic Vision of Ntozake Shange. Jennifer DeVere Brody will speak next on Everything You Do, Performing Shange's Work. And Farah Jasmine Griffin will close this session with a paper entitled Learning How to Listen, Ntozake Shange's Work as Aesthetic Primer. We will hear from all four of our speakers before we entertain questions and comments and celebrate their and Ms. Shange's brilliance. Please join me in welcoming our panel and Alexis Pauline Gumbs.
So my teachers are here. So I also thought very carefully about what would I wear and how to bring the women in my family are here. Everything that I'm wearing is a gift from a woman in my family. And two men in my family are here. My dad, Clyde Gumbs, and my cousin, Edward Ford III, are here. So of all the ways to be present at Barnard College, I feel a lot. So this is called Indigo Generations. 1, write the names. Can you find a pen? Can you find a blank enough space to write? Literally, do this for me. Analog, not iPad. Write the names. Write the names of the women who are not in this room, but without whom you would not be here or anywhere. This is for my mother, who handed me her copy of For Colored Girls when I was 14. This is for my grandmother, Lydia, who got her BA from Rutgers as a mother of 4 children. This is for my grandmother, Joyce, who immigrated illegally to this country and created a chosen family. For my sister Ariana, Barnard class of 2008, who taught me that to be a sister is my first and last job in the world. This is for Zora Neale Hurston and June Jordan and Edwidge Danticat, who, like Ntozake Shange, made me think Barnard College was a place where, of all things, Black women writers happened. This is for Cheryl Green, Wanima Lubiano, and Carla Holloway, who, like Monica Miller, Farah Griffin, Tina Campt, and Kim Hall, and Saidiya Hartman, exemplify the outrageous elegance of Black feminist critical practice. This is for Audre Lorde, for Barbara Smith, for Alice Walker, for Alexis DeVoe, for all the Black women writers who taught me that words were stronger than rape and stronger than death, and that I was strong enough to stand in a world unworthy of my own names. Write the names. Whisper the names. Write the names in the strongest ink you have right now, and tear them from the paper and put them in your mouth and pause. Chew on those names for a moment. Chew them back where your wisdom teeth would be. Swallow the wet wad of gratitude, or save it and bury it near where you sleep. Submerge it in a houseplant if you live in the city. Otherwise, we will be impossible. Write the names and put them in your mouth. This is how we get permission to speak. 2, indigo subjectivity. On this miraculous morning, on this land that can never be completely stolen from the indigenous mother warriors, on this land that would be impossible without the stolen labor of the slaves that were ourselves, on this land where McIntosh Hall used to stand, where I put flyers on bathroom mirrors and the insides of stalls that said, "There is no such thing as Pan-African Studies at Barnard," at a time when there was a Pan-African Studies major listed in the book, but not one dedicated faculty line to teach the related courses. When Pan-African Studies Program was the work study responsibility of a graduate student, in this basement, where in the Barnard Bulletin, I blasted the news that in 2002, according to the provost's office, there had been only 2 faculty of color tenured at Barnard ever in the hundreds of years of the school's existence. On this piece of land, I want to offer a ritual and, as it were, frame the day in the name of Indigo, a celebration of the presence of indigo on earth and the South in us. You might remember Indigo, the youngest sister in Ntozake Shange's first novel, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, that doll-making youngest sister talking to herself and all available spirits, that consort of church ladies and witness of magic in the street, that avant-garde fiddle priestess stringing the world back together with wild sound, that gangster girl, Geechee captain, adolescent hooligan running numbers and reading dreams for the redistribution of wealth and catfish in her Black Charleston community. That warrior healer writing 12-year-old remedies out of much older memory, eventually that midwife dancing by the ocean with the ancestrally free, bewildering her mother and her sisters with her folk presence, what they call the South in her. Indigo is here, in each of us who would dedicate time to honor our elders and spellcast the future. The South and global South in us, she is the energy teaching us to practice our bottom-up collective philosophies for real in this toppling evolutionary time on the planet. This is for the visionary in us and the collective power we can access. In other words, the primary theorist in this paper is a fictional 12-year-old. I want to offer as an injunction to my fellow highly theoretical scholarly colleagues and artists what Uncle John the Junk Man tells Indigo: we ain't the onlyest ones be talking with the unreal. Indigo had priorities for her people in Black Charleston and her people, who are all of us, gathered seriously in her name, which include daily visits with the spirits, the power to heal, and access to the moon, in the opposite order. So, today, in order to tell you about the work we are doing in the name of Indigo in my community in Durham, North Carolina, and to remind us of our connection to these 3 transformative skills, we're going to run the cycle backwards and do all 3. 3, Indigo days. Do you have something here given to you by someone who is not around? A healing presence in your life, a warrior on your behalf, Tina Camp has her grandmother's coat. I am wearing the jewelry of my grandmother and her outrageous sisters. You may have on your body, in your bag, something sacred passed around to you. It may be your body itself. Hold on to that medicine that connects you to a person who is not physically in this building. Remember that you already know how to transport spirit across space and through walls. Don't forget who is here with you listening. You understand? Listen deeper. In Durham, we read Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo as a sacred text and a blueprint. The Warrior Healers Organizing Trust, a local foundation dedicated to what we call organic reparations, the transformation of blood money into blood relations, participating in the end of capitalism, which, by the way, requires us to transform or to phase out economic currency and recenter around the primary ecological resource of love, by the way, makes grants to warrior healers, those oppressed geniuses practicing the fierce healing work of transformation in creative ways in our community. And when we wanted to think beyond the binary of masculine and feminine, beyond the fragmenting paradigm of either unhealthy, sustainable, round-the-clock organizing work to fight the injustices that harm our loved ones, or supposedly depoliticized healer, mother, wise irrelevance, we turned to Indigo, a true warrior healer, ferocious in her rootedness, transformative in her presence, grounded in the traditions of women, and yet unwesternizing the meaning of gender in her stand for dignity. And in summer 2011, self-identified Black warrior healers, which as you may know is not a census category yet, came from around the United States and gathered in Durham, North Carolina for a full week of intensive skill sharing and prismatic community building about our work as dancers, as visionary space activators, healing touch practitioners, artisans, designers, yoga teachers, womb healers, vegan black-eyed peas stirrers, and the performance troupe Body Ecology for a transformative intergenerational gathering where warrior healers from their teens to their 70s got our hands blue with the practical meaning and revolutionary purpose of our practices. And in a very Indigo way, I have to let you know that the 7-day Indigo gathering was not the result of any grant or outside funding whatsoever. It was 100% the result of Black warrior healers and our allies housing each other, feeding each other, crowd raising on Facebook for each other, and reminding ourselves and each other that we are enough. And not only when our priorities ironically, accidentally, or sadly converge with the priorities of the fabulously funded foundations who steady trying to get us to believe that Black love is not Black wealth. Thank Goddess Ntozake Shange for Indigo, who reminds us how money moves, how dreams are real, how everything is useful, and how we have what we need because we are what we need. Amen. Turn to your neighbor and give them a high five. All right. Warrior healer energy was in your hands already. I knew it. Indigo is here for Indigo Night School. So you might be getting the sense that I find the genius represented in the character Indigo immensely valuable for the sustaining and transformative practice of Black feminism. At some point, it was not enough to just keep buying copies of the novel, which I'm so grateful is back in print, Black in print, for people in my community, like the English teacher I am, begging them to read it. I needed to create structures through which my community, diversely literate and with widely varied access to education, could actually live daily, weekly, monthly, inside of what here we call the worlds of Ntozake Shange. And I won't talk about it now, but you can ask in a question if you want about the Sassafras Survival Salon, currently in motion in Durham, specifically to address relationship violence in our community, and the Rainbow Reclamations Ritual Series for women of color based on For Colored Girls. Ntozake Shange, your work is food and medicine in my community. And for now, I'm focusing on Indigo. For the new moon, we gather at what we call Indigo Night School, a space also known as my living room, for local Black warrior healers to practice collective versions of the individual healing rituals that Indigo designs for her dolls. Our elaborate full moon night tea rituals, where we drink phases of tea and work with the natural materials mentioned in Indigo's remedies, have been a life-saving space for those exact warrior healers, Black women and Black genderqueer visionaries, raising grandchildren, fighting for food justice, doing the daily work of anti-violence, struggling through their educations, and doing thankless labor all the time. At the door sits a bowl of steaming lavender water, and we wash off the day and place the names of the ancestors we bring in a bright orange bowl. We sit seriously, laughingly, lovingly. We stand under a magnolia tree saying 7 times the names of those who have hurt us to remove the scent of evil and release ourselves from trauma, dividing bowls of berries into cold water as temporary prayer beads, reading each other's dreams into numerically syllabalized poems of bite-sized wisdom, drinking consecutive teas, cinnamon, peppermint, raspberry leaf, chamomile, honey-sweetened blueberry for Indigo's sweet presence in our lives. And we witness each other's intentions for new moon empty full space in the sky. Every month I say, I never knew that it was possible for such a variety of Black folks, age and gender expression and practice-wise, to join so faithfully and sincerely in practicing the invented rituals of an invented Black genius, invented by a Black genius who I admire from afar. Do you really know how this work is valued outside of this room? And are you willing to bring it with you beyond the classroom, the stage, the page, back home to practice, Black home to practice? Do we love ourselves enough to, like June Jordan says, seize the world around us with our freedom? Do we love the work enough to join in it in the experimental practice that Ntozake Shange exemplifies, the fact that moving with these words into our whole lives, our families, kitchens, and living rooms can change everything? We all deserve a space to shake off the trauma of feeling that our words are not enough and our reality will not be respected. You deserve that. Indigo offers emergency care of your wounds that cannot be seen, educational and otherwise. So do this with me. Rock in the manner of a quiet sea, maybe forward and back, maybe side to side, in rhythm with your particular tide. Be sure that you are breathing. Hum softly from your heart. Whisper your own name with love. Alexis, 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 Alexis. Kiss your right shoulder. Now kiss your left shoulder. Right, we are on our way. One more section to go. We are on our way to the moon, in fact. Indigo knew she could travel to the moon anytime she wanted if she had the requisite plant matter and a connection to the women who came before her. 11-year-old Alex Lockhart, watching all of this Indigo Days magic happening at Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind, said to her mother, participant and novelist Zelda Lockhart, quote, I want to go to an after-school program for girls my age at Alexis's house. This was my MacArthur Genius Award, the sweetest validation that I was doing it right, that the young Black genius girls in my community would know that this queer relationship to Black feminist books I have is a space for them to live, a space for them to be themselves after school or anytime. It really should be the first line of my bio, my greatest achievement so far. Sister Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is available to 11-year-olds. So, of course, I turned to Indigo. And those at the time 6th grade girls just starting middle school, literally getting their periods for the first time at my house, surrounded by indigo and tea, were all the youngest sisters. We made dolls. We made a Pandora instrumental station for meditative writing. I tried it once, and they said, can we do this every week? I was like, yes. We checked in about how we were doing and blew bubbles to release any negative energy. Pop. We drank a special tea called Indigo is the Folks, designed especially for these girls by organic 4th-generation Black feminist herbalist and interdisciplinary artist Alexis Pierre Lewis. You know, there's some very powerful people in the world named Alexis, just saying. Should keep track of that. We ate decadent after-school meals prepared by grown participants in the eternal summer of the Black feminist mind who exemplified the belief that what and whether and how a Black girl eats after school is a community responsibility that goes far beyond individual mothers. The Indigo geniuses, in addition to providing rigorous cheering sections for each other's musical and dance recitals, creating a not-so-secret hideout that they tell everyone about in my backyard, and hosting an intergenerational Marvelous Menstruating Moments ritual gathering for period-age Black kids and their mamas and aunties that my mother and I co-facilitated, and creating a museum of sisterhood where they taught dozens of people in our community about their 11 commandments of sisterhood, and mentored people much older than them in the challenging practice of sistering in community, have now embarked on an outgrowth called Indigo Journeys, a series of Saturday field trips to important Black feminist sites in North Carolina, like Pauli Murray's house, Charlotte Hawken Brown's school, Ella Baker and Anna Julia Cooper's alma maters, as well as regular sites, local sites of their own breakthroughs, where they learned to ride bikes, where they stood up for themselves, and creating temporary installation monuments to their spatial practice of brilliance. Now in 7th grade, and moving from their demonstration in the twice-a-week after-school sessions in the Sisterhood Museum, where, by the way, you had to sing an affirming song to even get in the door, they demonstrated that they know how to create sacred space. And they are embarking on Indigo Journeys in order to deepen their practice of moving through the world as ancestrally connected sacred portal monument sites. Black 7th grade girls, moving in their power, the South in us. They continue Indigo's practice of creating and sharing the rituals they need. Here are 3 of the remedies they came up with on the very first day of Indigo After School, which actually we are now offering in broadside form as a gift if you want to donate towards the Indigo Journeys program. Here are their remedies inspired by emergency care for wounds that cannot be seen. Emergency Care for the Funk by Bailey Jo Wadlington. Like on Glee, when they were in a funk because they were afraid their singing group wasn't good enough. Surround oneself with loved ones. Then go on top of a tall object and scream to heart's content all of one's deepest feelings. If this does not work, go in a private room and listen to songs that mention only of happy things. Then write down all of one's problems and think of a way to turn them around. Emergency for Sadness by Asada Carter Goff. 1, go to the bathroom and turn on hot water. Let it steam. 2, get your favorite incense and burn it. 3, get a robe and put it on. 4, put the incense in the bathroom. So specific, oh, love it. 5, put a stool in the bathroom. 6, write all the things you are sad about on a piece of paper. 7, write on the steamed mirror all the things that are peaceful. 8, sit in the bathroom and be peaceful with the steaming and the incense. Forged by Fire, for Hard Experiences That Change You Forever, by Alex Lockhart. Bathe in a tub of warm water without bubbles. Slowly lie down and let all the bad energy out. When you get out, don't dry off. Instead, go to a silent room and let the peaceful air dry you off. Next, rub your skin with soothing lavender oil. Now, go outside and let the sun wrap its loving rays around you. These are our indigos. Witness your own indigo subjectivity, the South in us. To paraphrase Ntozake Shange, they serve notice that the colored children are manifestations of the 21st century and every century before. How can you doubt that we can go to the moon, or stay here and evolve into alignment with the planet, or do anything else we might collectively need to do? Take 5 quick breaths. And 3 slow ones. Yes. Yes, we are on our way. Thank you.
Thank you for your attendance this morning. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, Tina Kampt, Kim Hall, Monica Miller, and Yvette Christianse, for their invitation. I also want to thank Ntozake Shange herself for her life's work, and to her parents, Eloise Williams and Dr. Paul T. Williams, to whom she attributes her introduction to the many cultures of the African diaspora. Ms. Shange is a writer perhaps best known for her choreo poem for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. Less well known by the general reading public are her poems, essays, children's books, and novels, the first of which is Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. This was such amazing planning, you don't even know. I would like to pause and say, the slides that I'm going to show you are all quotes from her essays, the collection Lost in Language and Sound, which is outside for sale, but the presentation is about Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And so I do that to demonstrate and to perhaps highlight the consistency of what she says. I will not be making reference to the slides behind me. There should be perhaps someone passing out the slides for those of you who are interested in those quotes. If not, she should. There they go. Hi, Renee. Okay. Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo is the story of three girls of the title and their mother, Hilda Ephania, in Charleston, South Carolina, and later in Southern California, New York, and New Orleans. It is also a heterogeneous novel in form, as the author includes recipes, rituals, as Alexis has highlighted, prayers, numbers to play depending on the situation, letters, songs, and performance reviews. All are included in a narrative that also features poetry and drama. In this paper, I focus on how Shange associates each of her female protagonists with the spiritual entities of both the Yoruba and Diomean traditions found in the New World, Vudung and Regla de Ocha, or Lukumi, or Santeria. She writes about Oshun, Shango, Dambala, Esuli, and Ziamvalu. She does so in order to reveal the depth and complexity of U.S. communities of descendants of enslaved Africans, which is often represented as homogeneous. With her three protagonists, Shange highlights different cultural influences, epistemologies, and artistic expressions of this diverse population. She also reveals the richness of our disparate selves. Throughout her first novel, Ntozake Shange makes numerous references to the history of the Middle Passage, the dispersal of enslaved men and women throughout the Americas and their descendants. Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo are in contact with these spirits through their artistic expression. They play music, they dance, they weave, they create art. The spirits communicate with them in their dreams as well as in their chosen professions. They inform every decision these young women make in their lives and serve as both guides and witnesses to all that they do. The protagonists, in turn, pay tribute to these spirits by listening to them, following their cues about how to live their lives as they attempt to find that which is in keeping with their destinies. In this novel, Shange creates an atmosphere in which humans live alongside the spirits of long-dead ancestors who guide humanity as they try to survive the trials of life, presented here primarily as sexism, racism, homophobia, discrimination, poverty, and out-and-out discrimination, as well as a rupture between spirituality and day-to-day existence. Throughout the text, the narrative voice calls on those who have come before for their guidance and assistance. The phrase, "and the slaves who were ourselves," appears 6 times throughout the course of the novel, acting both as a chorus and as a reminder of the omnipresence of ancestors who walk with us. Shange puts forth that these spirits live, then, so long as their descendants live. We, the audience, walk with these souls as our guides. Indigo's gift is to feel intuitively the emotions of others, including those of the spirits who walk with her. As an adolescent, she begins to spend time in the caverns, a winding complex of underground rooms where gambling, cockfights, and a 24-hour social room entertain the most adventurous of Charleston's colored subterraneans, end quote. After a quick fight with the girlfriend of the owner of the caverns, Indigo escapes through the halls, only to stop and take note of her surroundings. The narrator remarks, "The slaves who were ourselves had known terror intimately, confused sunrise with pain, and accepted indifference as kindness. Now they sang out from the walls, pulling Indigo toward them. Indigo ran her hands along the walls to get the song, get a hold to the voices. Rust covered her palms and fingers. She kept following the rings. Indigo knew her calling. The colored had hurt already enough." Indigo is the healer. In listening to the plight of those who have passed generations before her existence, she alleviates their pain. The novelist suggests that the grief of those who have passed has gone ignored. The slave trade therefore leaves a fundamental rupture in how those who are presently living treat their dead. There has been little honoring the plight of those first inhabitants of the Americas on the part of our larger societies, simply by saluting the agony, honoring it, staying in it, rather than overlooking their anguish for the sake of one's own comfort. Indigo gains the trust of these spirits, and with that trust, access to new sources of knowledge. With this scene, Shange strongly indicts all of our cultures, both US-based and throughout the Americas, particularly this one, which actively encourages a discarding of the past. She also advocates that her audience honor their dead, and in doing so, they can not only restore the spirit guides that attend to each person, they will also initiate the healing of their own families and, by extension, larger diasporic communities. At the end of the novel, the narrator implies that Indigo might be the direct descendant, if not the reincarnation, of an enslaved African woman who was owned by the Fitzhughs, the same family for whom the girl's mother works. Like Indigo, Blue Sunday, quote, moved the sea. Every time her master would attempt to approach her, the ocean would react violently. Quote, the sea would get a fuming, swinging whips of salt water around the house where the white folks lived, end quote. Seawater would have negatively affected their crop, indigo. And so there was a financial effect for his attempted indiscretions. He makes a fool of himself for this favorite of his, lavishing silks on her. She, in turn, leaves them for the hogs. In an attempt to tame her, he whips her in front of her fellow enslaved Africans, then gives her to 2 overseers to be raped. She, nevertheless, remains inviolate. When he himself penetrates her, she turns into a crocodile, biting his leg, and disappears. This is the spirit that walks with Indigo. She who, quote, changed the nature of things, who colored and made richer what was blank and plain, end quote. The audience learns more about Indigo's character when we learn about those who guide her. Not only does Shange associate Indigo with spirits, but also with Orishas. Her name reminds the reader of the color blue, the color associated with Yemoja, the entity whose primary element is salt water, i.e. the oceans. As we have seen, Indigo has a relationship with the ocean that laps the shores of Charleston, South Carolina. Salt waters also refer to amniotic fluid. As an adult, she works as a midwife. Yemoja is the entity identified with motherhood. In her capacity as midwife, Indigo may also be associated with Oshun, who is a spiritual entity affiliated with femininity, and to whom women who want to be mothers appeal. Like Indigo, her sister Cypress also has an extensive interaction with both the spirits and the Orishas. While Indigo appeals to her spirits through her music, she plays the fiddle as a child, Cypress does so when she dances. If Indigo is the healer, Cypress is definitively the dancer, she who accesses the divine through the movement of her body. With Cypress, Shange provides a reflection on the relationship between a woman's body and her sense of self. In the details of her description, the reader notices that Shange affiliates Cypress with Oshun, not only because she is a dancer, but also because she is inspired by mirrors, Oshun's primary implement, She lives in an apartment of amber and green, two colors associated with this entity of femininity. She compares her lovers to Shango, recalling the relationship between Oshun and Shango. And with Cyprus, Shange focuses on eroticism. As the entity that is most associated with the female element, as Shango is with the male, Oshun is often misunderstood to encompass the sacred prostitute or whore. Instead, she is the full embodiment of womanhood, and one who celebrates the healthy sexuality of woman celebrates Oshun. As a dancer, Cyprus becomes jaded in her first professional dance troupe because there was a relentless exchange of partners amongst the men and women of the group, to the extent that sex no longer meant anything but a bartering of fluids. The narrator comments, quote, "The lovemaking was so active and one-dimensional, Cyprus preferred pulling coats around her ears and sleeping with her face in the corner." End quote. This recalls Audre Lorde's remarks about pornography in her landmark essay, Uses of the Erotic is Power. Quote, "Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling." End quote. The narrator implies that for these dancers, sex has become another physical expression of their bodies rather than of themselves as whole beings. Cyprus finds this emphasis on wholeness with her next company, an all-female group called Azure Bottom, again the use of blue, recalling Imoja. With them, she is able to revel in her womanhood. Quote, "They were regarded as the thrust of the future for women in dance, articulating what women had never acknowledged. Our bodies are not destiny, but all freeing energy. Azure Bottom brought men, women to tears, to joy, a sense of quiet easiness they had never known." With their performances, this troupe creates a safe space for females in their audience, allowing them to celebrate themselves without hyper-consciousness about who is looking at their bodies and an attendant analysis about that gaze. The narrator states clearly that another routine recalls the Haitian loa associated with the feminine. She writes, quote, "How do she do is the coquette Ersouli, introduced to modern lovers, unaccustomed to pure pleasure of flesh and spirit combined. She allowed women to linger in their own eroticism, to be happy with loving themselves." In her seminal article on this figure, Joan Dayan writes, quote, "The presence of Ersouli in writerly reenactments fixes an erotic impulse into image," end quote. Ersouli of the Diomean tradition, brought over to Haiti, corresponds to, or is similar to Oshun of the Yoruba tradition. With the mention of Ersouli, Shange posits the erotic as an energy that empowers women as natural to their being, something separate from an expression of sexuality. Audre Lorde's words about the power of the erotic come to mind, quote, "When I speak of the erotic, then I speak of it as an assertion of the life force of women, of that creative energy empowered, the knowledge and the use of which we are now reclaiming in our language, our history, our dancing, our loving, our work, our lives," end quote. For Cyprus, she is able to discover this force amongst a group of women when they are in performance. Outside of their presentations, however, she grows dissatisfied, comparing their interactions to a slave market. Only when she is in relationship with Leroy, a musician and a friend, does she find fulfillment. After a night of lovemaking, Cyprus comments, quote, "She was warm, felt so good. She giggled, getting together where she was. Who was this? Why so good? Here she was herself again. She was her own mystery," end quote. The act of lovemaking then brings Cyprus back to herself. She is able to revel in her femininity in the face of the masculine element. In Leroy, Cyprus finds her complement, her balance. In achieving this, a sense of equilibrium, she feels free, a quality that reveals itself most clearly in her dance. In her relationship, she can accept herself as she is, recognizing those parts that remain unknown, even to her. With Leroy by her side, Cyprus permits herself to celebrate herself as a whole being. Cyprus's oldest sister, Sassafras, also searches for this sense of wholeness. For her, the clearest way to achieve it is by undergoing ceremony in the Yoruba African diasporic religion known as Regla de Ocha, or Lukumi, or Santeria. Prior to this moment, the narrator focuses on Sassafras's relationship with her boyfriend Mitch, a saxophonist who, quote, thought of himself as a god. He is a demanding lover, one who believes Sassafras should conduct herself in a proper way, demure, ladylike, quiet. He believes, for example, that a sequin and feather hanging shaped like a vagina should be hidden. Quote, it wasn't proper for a new African woman to make things of such a sexual nature, end quote. In attempting to control her art, and by extension her, Mitch tries to separate that which comes naturally to Sassafras. She creates her hanging in honor of Josephine Baker. Far from being reductively essentialist, it is a celebration of a woman who celebrated her eroticism on stages around the world. Sassafras is therefore paying tribute to a woman who expressed her whole integrated self, sexuality included. In her study of eroticism in Black women's writing, Donna Asa Ware-Soley writes, quote, while Western epistemology locates the sacred and the secular in separate and even opposing realms, the African worldview recognizes no such separation. This underscores the irony of Mitch's assertion that a new African woman, quote, would do no such thing as create a rendering of female genitalia. His vision of Africa is a patriarchal one in which he controls all that surrounds him, including his lover. For much of their storyline, in fact, Mitch abuses Sassafras, belittling her, though she views his comments as encouragement. Shange writes, quote, she did want to be perfected for him, like he was perfected and creating all the time, end quote. She's placed him on a pedestal, treating him as the god he believes himself to be, following his lead. In doing so, she minimizes herself, disregarding her goals for herself. Quote, she didn't care about her dreams if her truth, her real life, was hurting, and Mitch was real life, and needing from her was something she could give, and did, end quote. In spite of his constant disdain for what she wants, and despite the beating that she suffers at his hands, she remains with him. Her subsequent possession by the Orisha Oshun should be seen as an attempt to rectify this imbalance. Shange writes, Sassafras has tried everything to be a decent Ibeji, a santera. She desperately wanted to make ocha, to wear white with her eleques, to keep the company of priests and priestesses. During the first year of initiation, a practitioner of Regla de Ocha, or Lukumi religion, the Iyawo, will wear all white. He or she is a newborn, and so must be swaddled. The eleques of which she makes mention are, quote, the beaded color-coded necklaces of the 5 principal deities, Elegua, Obatala, Chango, Oshun, and Yemaya. With these necklaces, the initiate obtains the spiritual force of the Orishas and their protection, end quote. Sassafras's desire to keep company with priests and priestesses reveals to us that she wants to consecrate her life, make it holy, and live for a bigger purpose. Shange implies that this possible purpose may be the healing of the community of those descended from Africans here in the New World, referring to the music that accompanies the religious celebration for which Sassafras is preparing. The author writes, quote, drums and chanting ran through the lush backwoods of Louisiana. Sassafras liked to think the slaves would have been singing like that if the white folks hadn't stolen our gods, made our gods foreign to us. In this passage, Shange directly addresses the suspicion and mistrust that often plagues practitioners of traditional African religions here in the Americas. Under the aegis of Christianity, those practices have been associated with devil worship, black magic, or at the very least, just plain craziness. And yet here, she presents the celebration as an act of restoration, of honoring those who have come before. Shange identifies Sassafras as being a child of Shango and Oshun. Both of these entities, in addition to being the embodiments of masculinity and femininity, are also associated with justice. Though Sassafras desires to be a priestess of Oshun so that, in her words, she could, quote, heal bring love and beauty wherever she went. The vision of Oshun we later see is one more characterized by wrath. Shange writes, "Sassafras was in the throes of the wrath of Oshun. How dare you betray me?" Her foot stomped. "How dare you not recognize my beauty?" Her hands brought forth the mirror wherein she admired herself. "How dare you make no preparations for my child, who is a gift of las potencias, the spirits?" Here we see an entity who is very protective of her child, who demands at minimum respect for everything that she is, and by extension, everything that her children are. She demands that preparations be made for Sassafras, that there is recognition that this woman is a sacred being. The questions asked are directed at Mitch, Sassafras's lover, who has, in the words of Sassafras's godmother, led her away from righteousness. Quote, "He is a man unfit for the blessings of the spirits." End quote. Oshun wants her child to find someone who is worthy of her, who can and will appreciate the beautiful creature that she is. This applies to the initiate who is consecrated to this specific Orisha, and in fact to all human beings, for we are all children of God, the highest, and his entities, the Orishas. In this way, then, Shange urges healing on the level of both the individual, as in the case of Sassafras, and also on the level of community. We must all not only learn our own value, but also exist within a community that respects said worth. Shange's novel examines the lives of women of the African diaspora. She establishes this focus with her first paragraph of the novel. Where there is a woman, there is magic. If there is a moon falling from her mouth, she is a woman who knows her magic, who can share or not share her powers. A woman with a moon falling from her mouth, roses between her legs, and tiaras of Spanish moss. This woman is a consort of the spirits. Shange clearly states that women are more intimate with the metaphysical, with the magical. She also implies that each woman has a sense of her own agency. She can choose to, quote, share or not share her powers, provided that, quote, there is a moon fallen from her mouth, end quote. The moon here signifies life, reproduction, as well as unspoken mystery. The moon is wisdom. For Shange, then, a woman who knows herself, who has a deep understanding of her own mystery, who respects and acknowledges this as a sort of life, this woman is magic. It is in acknowledging the unknown and the unknowable that woman is able to consort with the spirits. For the African diaspora is composed not only of those who live, but also those souls whose lives were cut short by enslavement, war, untenable working conditions, sickness, poverty. She posits that women are the primary bearers of the spiritual in this group. They communicate better with the unknown, again, if they are fully themselves. The youngest daughter, Indigo, is the chief example of a female who understands herself, is true to herself at the risk of displeasing her mother. With her older sisters, we see a journey of reconciliation. Both Sassafras and Cyprus come to respect and acknowledge their own mysteries as women. While Cyprus settles into a monogamous, heterosexual relationship with Leroy, after dalliances with both men and women, the climax of Sassafras' storyline is becoming a priestess in the New World Yoruba religion of the Gladeocha. In this novel, and indeed in many of her works, Shange creates multi-dimensional characters that recall the expansiveness of the African diaspora. For Sassafras, Cyprus, and Indigo, their interactions with the Loas and Orishas inform their sense of themselves as women in the Americas. Refuting patriarchal definitions of womanhood in their writings, she replaces flat representations of the feminine with multifaceted characterizations of women that celebrate mind and body, secular and spiritual. In this way, Shange finds in the Daomean and Yoruba traditions and their New World variants an effective strategy, not only for personal, but also communal liberation. Thank you.
I am really humbled and honored to be here. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to Monica, Kim, Tina, and Yvette for inviting me. And a shout out to Tina and to Alexis. This is my grandmother, Maud DeVere, white, bright, my grandmother's black jet ring that I'm wearing. Because yes, we need to keep the spirit with us. And I want to thank also this group of folks, Ebony, Catherine, Gabrielle, Victoria, Elena, Sarah, and Simone, who performed last night. And I put this picture up because part of what I'm going to talk about today, and I think you've already heard, I'm so lucky to be coming now after Alexis and also Vanessa's wonderful presentations about performance and also about the power of sassafras, cypress, and indigo. So I thank them for their performances last night. It's a joy to be part of this event with my fellow panelists, Alexis, Vanessa, Farah, later on Mecca, Soika, and Harriet. And I too am here with friends old and new, and that is an honor. So there's a long list of shout outs. I'm going to try not to take too much time with this, but I agree, as Tina and Alexis and so many of us do, that it's important to do. So to Judy Gran, who was one of the people who inspired for Colored Girls, according to Shange, Pratibha Pamar, Coco Fusco, Jamaica Kincaid, Fran Ross, Carmen de Lavalade, my Aunt Baby, Jessica Hagedorn, Tony K. Bambara, Julie Dash, and to all the women in the struggle, and especially, of course, to Ms. Ntozake Shange for your wondrous creations, which is to say, your everything. So my remarks, everything you do, performing Ntozake's work, focus on two examples in Ms. Shange's performative interdisciplinary art on the aesthetics of what she calls everydayness. And that's a word I want us to keep in mind. So there's an epigraph. We must move our theater into the drama of our lives. Now, you could immediately think that somehow that's a redundant statement, but the theater here is spelled with an R-E, and drama has its own particular signification. Let me see if I can unravel it. This statement by Shange, who describes herself as a poet in theater, suggests that the house of high art, the theater spelled with an R-E, resides not only on a proscenium stage, but also and equally in our daily lives, in our everydayness. It is a way of saying that creation is everything you do, make something. It's also a way, I think we heard earlier in Tina's talk about making herself, rather Monica's introduction, of making herself a primary source. Shange revels in radically interdisciplinary art practice that gives performative presence to a differing diasporic colored women's movements in music, dance, recipes, and poems. And I think it's really important that here we just take a moment to dance with our arms, as Ms. Shange herself was doing last night. So let's just do a breath up and a little bit of manipulation and open. It feels really good, doesn't it? Don't you feel your heart beating? It's important. Now I can read. I think that her frank discussions of everyday violence and dispossession of colored folks and girls specifically, and her experimental forms challenge readers and viewers, even as such forms hail them as participants in the worlds Ntozake Shange creates. Her worldview, her primary theory, and we do not need Heidegger or Spivak here, speaks to her creative powers, her collective visions that gather force in and through repetition and revision, right? And I think we'll see this performed on the panel as we all are talking about a similar object in our own differently styled ways. Thus, calling the conference the Worlds of Ntozake Shange, a performance and a conference, is apt because Shange has a global reach and vision, at once otherworldly and down to earth. That is the magic manifested in so much of her art, which requires breath to live. Our lives, the quotidian lives of colored folks, the girls in particular, thank you so much, are full of drama and are the very stuff of theater. Certainly this was the genius for colored girls that began in my new home, the Bay Area, Oaktown, Berkeley, and San Francisco, that hotbed of countercultural movements, women's studies, alternative activism, feminist presses, black arts, and especially so when Shange was there. This space materializes in her novella, which was Sassafras, published by Shameless Hussy Press, before it became the brilliant novel Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, published in 1982. So this is a page from Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, which has the injunction from Mitch that creation is everything you do, make something, from which I take my title. But what's sad is we don't see here the embroidery that Sassafras embellished this with that hangs above the stove. So just keep that one in mind. So this is the journey then from the Bay Area to what became Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, and so much of the artwork that is important in terms of Shange's aesthetic that moves freely, if precisely, among and between different forms: cooking, dancing, weaving, writing, singing, playing, eating, and dreaming. And this is the Bacchanal, which was a women's bar that was also a place where for colored girls first was performed. And the Oakland bars are still pretty good, I can attest to that. And I'm putting out here some images that are photographic, of sort of realist images of Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, right, to talk about then how they get transformed into art. This is the practice then of creating the things that we take from the everyday and transforming them into Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And each of the leaves there are many covers. It's so great to see it back in print and to see the different editions, but each of those figures is a leaf in the way that you would think about the lady in red, the lady in brown, as both material and symbolic simultaneously. The daily doing with prescribed norms and according to an evolving aesthetic is something that was also important to Zora Neale Hurston, Barnard class of 28, about whom we've heard a lot, and there's a great edition of Scholar and Feminist online that you should check out about Hurston. But Hurston wrote specifically about that term drama with which I began, which permeates Negro life, of our will to adorn and to transform the known world, of how the Negro's words are action words. One example she gives is chop axe. Right, that we're always adding an action to the noun. It's not enough just to say axe, we want to chop axe. How we turn nouns into verbs, one of the examples of which is, I would not friend her. Sorry, Facebook. That was 1934. These insights from Hurston's essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, published in 1934, how many people know that essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression? Okay, go back to it. It is still one of the most illuminating texts about Black culture, and also has been called by Dwight Conkergood as one of the foundational texts for that Made in America form, like jazz, which is to say my field of expertise, performance studies. So I write these key insights from, I recite these key insights from Hurston's essay here because they are at play, albeit differently, in Shange's work. And I think also Hurston is important because in Mules and Men, which was the first autoethnographic, Black person talking about Black work ever written in the United States, first anthropological study, also includes recipes from Haiti at the end, right? So there's a whole kind of correspondence and important connection and interplay between those two texts. And I think that some of the recipes in Mules and Men that are important that kind of show up in, and we've heard about a little bit from Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo's recipes in particular are, and these are from Mules and Men, how to rent a house, how to make a man come home, and how to deal with court scrapes. And for the latter, you would need whiskey and John the Conqueror root that is soaked for 38 hours, and when soaked and drained, they need to be mixed with White Rose or Jockey Club perfume. You dress the client in the mixture. And I just want to point out there that one of the important insights from Hurston's text that I think is very much at work in Shange's kind of dedication to the folk and to the everyday is that folk tales are anything but quote unquote primitive or only from the past, right? They're still evolving, they carry into the present, they have a futurity, which I think is something also that we heard from Alexis's work. So when Shange says that her pen is a machete, which may explain her penchant for slashes like the one that appears in For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide, When the Rainbow Is Enough, we see her here how her language and her choreopoems split syntax, interrupt linearity, deform and fragment sentences as she captures the sound and rhythms of the voices that emerge from women's bodies, touching, creating meetings from the depths of their absence. Shange does this throughout her work, and it's in the recipes as well. In her manifesto and performance, in the preface for Colored Girls, she talks about her body and mind ellipsing, probably the first time in her life. And that's an image then of one of the verbs that, or nouns you can turn into a verb, to ellipse, to be ellipsing. And I think it's a really great figure, again, of this movement between the symbolic, the material, the performed, and the performative. Shange says that she learned to move what was my unconscious knowledge of being in a colored woman's body to my known everydayness. And again, that word is written as one term and kind of a perfect enjambment, which for me performs its philosophical value. Her genius is to show us the value of art in the everydayness, at once a doing and a thing done. Shange writes that she was raised to experiment with taste and sound, and thus her interest in music, language, and food. And that's from her book, If I Can Cook, You Know God Can Too. She knows that we are what we consume and that the ritual practices we do honor our orifices, all of them. Mind and motion move us, become us. She says that she is the kind of poet she is because she has always been a performing poet. And here I want to talk a little bit again about the importance of performance and performing in her work. She believed that from her Euro-American training that the Greeks were right. Poetry must be heard. I knew as a black person that when I asked someone for a poem, I didn't mean for them to give me a book. I meant for them to deliver it, say it, jump it, fire in the air, the power and the magic. That was always. Her phrase, speaking American ain't necessarily nourishing, is another example that gives us more insight into the significance of performance, of recipes, of food and spells that appear in Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, and if I can cook, you know God can too. So I'm not going to talk too much about Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo because my colleagues have done so, but it is, like the recipes which are included in it, a text that is made out of varying ingredients. So fonts vary, italics, calling cards appear, poems, lyrics, journals, entries, a review, spells, invitations to wassails on white paper, and other graphic flourishes. And orthographically, it's really very interesting, as just that one page, I think, began to show you. These performative elements, then, no less than the lighting cues that surrealize the actually colored girls and the performance of for colored girls, make them into persons personified and abstracted, even as they are resolutely material, emotional, and present. Sassafras demonstrates the will to adorn that it mentioned from Hurston and her desire for excess beauty. And one of the phrases for characteristics in Negro of expression is, we can never have enough beauty, right? And so that's speaking to a whole Enlightenment tradition, which, like the phrase that was up there about learning to curse, why would I speak a language in which I was taught to hate myself? This idea that we can never have enough beauty because so much of Western culture has painted us as black, as lack, as the negative, right? So one of the remedies for that, which comes up in Cypress, Sassafras, and Indigo, is to think about excess. And so in the book, Sassafras says to Mama, when I told the white folks at school that I wanted some red sauce and rice and shrimp with clams, hot sausage, corn, okra, chicken, and crab meat for dinner, they'd go around campus saying, you know, that Negro girl overdoes everything. Can you imagine what she wanted for dinner? So in an interview to the New York Times in 1993, Shange commented on the recipes in Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo by saying that they become part of the plot, which describes the lives of the three sisters. You have to read the entire recipes, ingredients, and procedures, because if you don't really know what's going on with these girls. She notes as well that she didn't want readers to skip over the recipes, as they would therefore lose the sense of the text and the depth of the meaning of what they were doing there. I wanted these recipes to create a place to be. So the recipes should be and can be made by us, and I'm really, again, heartened by Alexis taking them off the stage of the page into life and making that circular loop between the doing, the reading, and showing that seamless connection among the arts in that interdisciplinary way. And I think it also speaks to the way in which we as readers are part of the collective participatory aspect of her art, even in her writing. So not just being spectators in an audience like this, but also we literally have to think about when we read those recipes, as I just read you some of them, no doubt saliva may have started, right? You have an embodied reaction to that. The recipes are also exchanged through letters, creating a community among the women in the text, but also among us. The epistolary has a direct address, and they're often labeled and numbered, and they become also then part of recipes for life, like Jamaica Kincaid's little short story, Girl, right, which gives these sort of lessons on femininity. In the writing here is the body, is the material. Abstracted as art, yes, but also carrying history, culture, and stuff. Should a reader cook rice casserole number 36, or one of Sassafras's recipes, or a favorite spinach, the reader can be right in her kitchen, right in the book, right? And so it leaves this sort of dilemma of also where that book belongs, right? In terms of, do you have it next to the bed as kind of food pornography, and I have a different reading than Lord and on the erotic, but maybe that's for later. Or do you carry it, right? You take it in the kitchen. You carry it with you, like the things that we do and know. So recipes, even as written text, appear in the imperative, prescriptive, sequential, and they are inherently shared. The term is derived from the Latin word take, which seems to seem fitting in this context, since many enslaved cooks stole food from their masters in what Jackie Jones claims was a political move, giving the stolen victuals often to runaway slaves. Nevertheless, the recipes are a form of orature that mediates speech and writing, which are mutually constitutive. Once the ingredients are listed, the recipe must have some effect. They are meant to be efficacious. They are blueprints for success, and as we heard in Alexis's talk with her Indigo girls, and I'm going to also say a little something there about the lesbian group Indigo girls, we can kind of mess with that together. Sometimes they fail and you have to try again or do something else. So that even though, the point here I'm trying to make is that even though something is a written text, even though a recipe is by nature injunctive and prescribed, it nevertheless leaves room for improvisation and for participation. You can try it, you can add a little more salt, or often in the recipes that are included in Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, they'll say things like, I know you know how to make hominy, and so that recipe doesn't appear. My own grandmother's last letter to me, which she sent to me when I was at Vassar College in 1987, months before she died, was a recipe for stewed tomatoes with plenty onions, enough sugar. It came with other recipes for life. Be sweet, get your lessons. And so by pointing out the notion of plenty onions, enough sugar, right, it leaves a sense of that you're not sort of slave, right, to the recipe. So even though it's Mitch's injunction that everything you do is a creation to make something, I think that we can read it in a more feminist way, and it, for me, informs so much of Shange's work. Sassafras's rice casserole number 36, which I mentioned earlier, and there are so many recipes, and the book is too big to do justice to here, but I just want to point out that labeling it number 36 makes it like music, to which we can always think about as the kind of supreme art, and something that Shange says of herself, that she writes poems for the music, or a Whistler painting, right? They are specified and they are belonging to a particular author, even as they are also shared in a performative space. So the other thing is that the recipes and the generations can go in multiple directions. Mama's able to transform her Christmas recipe to fit Kwanzaa and changes out pork for turkey. Indigo spells cure cultural wounds, and Shange's quick to tell us that the word recipe is also a correlate of receipt, which is how they said recipes in Charleston. So it's that whole idea of the poultice, of the healing ritual, of food for thought and life, and ways in which the recipes can in fact engage and impel us and compel us to really do more with what we are doing in terms of the kinds of texts that we have. She also is always concerned, as with Indigo, of the slaves who are ourselves. And if I can cook, you know God can. Shange talks about the way we eat what the slaves eat, just differently. These recipes have stayed with us for centuries, being improvised here and there, where we found something that we were accustomed to, say, in Guinea, was not available in the mouth of the Amazon. We changed it out. And this is actually a photograph from 1976 from one of my own family's Easter dinners. I know it's not quite lunch yet, we have to hear from Farah, but we're getting ready. So that quote I just read, I think, exemplifies her style. What this shows us is how women feeding their families was an exercise in power, love, and not simply sociological. Recipes are mediated art events, stylized texts that gesture towards performance. They have a politics and a poetics. They help us see how Shange's art nourishes. It is never two-dimensional, how it eschews the cut and dry. The version of an iconic hero, freedom fighters such as Toussaint Louverture, is saucy. She wants to know, what did you eat to celebrate a revolution? She brings the body back and forth, making us all hungry for more. Verda Smart Grosvenor's Vibration Cooking is another text that does this with letters, and it's Surprised that she did the introduction to "If God Can Cook, if God can cook, you know God can too." And in that foreword, she says that Jacques, in the tradition of Dumas, Colette, and Jorge Amado, and other writers, understands the importance and connections of food and culture and how they are intertwined in our everyday lives and manifest on our tables. Shange's interdisciplinary approach to art matters in all senses of the term. The restitution of okra's reputation is one of Shange's projects, as is reclaiming eating watermelon, something bougie black folks were discouraged from doing. And my mother and her mother, Mrs. Williams, were girlfriends, not the kind of girlfriends like I have, but there used to be a chapter like the Links of this bougie organization called the Girlfriends, of which my mother was president when my state mate and was the Trenton chapter of the Girlfriends in New Jersey, right? So Shange is a performance artist concerned with the materiality of culture. Her novels feature recipes as a collective and improvisational response, a call to improvisational response. She produces choreo poems that, like everything she does, envelop an entire social milieu, including the audience that happened to show up as the piece evolved, and who should be seen as another source of the performance that develops through ritualized combinations of commentary, contribution, and endorsement, according to Ken Binston. The ongoing open structure credits adaptation as a factor of artistic creation. In Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, the ordinary is made extraordinary, and adaptation is key. To call it an epistolary novel flattens it out because the book works on and through us. It is a conjure book, dream book, recipe book, a talking book, and its pages are performative. Its contents do not contain, but rather obtain their power through use, embodied engagement, and puts to shame to the concept of an active reader or even reader response theory. It captures and compels lived experience. And I've already mentioned about the importance of how the letters are shared and recipes are shared in letter form among the community. I'm just going to conclude by reading a piece about Diane McIntyre that Shange wrote that I think, again, underscores this aesthetic that requires audience participation and improvisation. Shange encourages us to take a different approach to the force of gravity, to our bodies and what we produce. We are performers in the field, the kitchens, by kilns and for one another. In Movement, Melody, Muscle, Meaning, McIntyre, Shange explains that she sees McIntyre's work, and their performance last night was so beautiful, as moving towards sculpted impulse and labyrinthine density, with its reliance on Afro-American popular dance, respect for Afro-American music, and a sense of the conceptual realities available to us through these forms. It is not that McIntyre's works rejects folklore, but her versions of what is folklore formed by the here and now, a point I made earlier, again, underscored, right, that we can't think about this as some kind of immediate access to the past or romanticization of the folk, as Hazel Carby would say. These are things that live on through us and through our breath. These are no accidental ethnic references. It is all on purpose. These lines, for me, obtain equally well to Shange's own aesthetic praxis. Her continual staging of embodying engagements with encounter and rule, proximity, consumption, incorporation, or what Kyla Tompkins has recently called racial indigestion, carnality, as we heard last night when Shange talked about what was stuck in her throat, all valorize the raw everydayness that can be cooked, created, and made into visceral art. It is, simply put, everything you do. Ms. Shange, thank you for teaching us how to, quote, pull the so-called personal out of the realm of non-art. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So this book, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, we didn't talk to each other. But I do think this Indigo is a magic child because she decided she wanted to dominate this morning. My title is Learning How to Listen Ntozake Shange's work as an aesthetic primer. The primer of the title refers to two meanings of that word. One, a book that covers the basic elements of a subject, and then a lesser-known meaning, which I think is especially fitting for Shange's work, all of it, and for Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. A second definition, a primer is a prayer book or a devotional manual for the use of lay people. For over 3 decades, Shange's writing has been a source of pleasure and insight, the subject of theoretical, historical, and cultural musings. In all of these instances, it has also served as a kind of primer which introduces readers to contemporary music, art, dance, and culinary practices, and provides a context and a set of aesthetic principles for appreciating them. Furthermore, if the content of her work engages these art forms, the form of her written work does so as well. Her words dance, sing, and construct visual design on the page. This paper will focus primarily on music because that has been the subject of my own research of late, but what is said here holds true for Shange's literary relationship to dance and the visual and culinary arts as well. Her meditations on and representations of Black art and its production yield exciting and beautiful insight, a few of which follow. One, that Black art is already cosmopolitan, that cosmopolitan doesn't mean having to deny Blackness or distance oneself from it, but instead it broadens our understanding of what constitutes the Black in Black art. Two, that art is necessary for personal and collective survival. And that three, art, especially Black art, is a source of historical, political, and spiritual sustenance, that it's powerful enough to, in the words of a daughter's geography, send old white men over the edge of the earth that they still believe to be flat. That it is nurturing enough to help us feed our children the sun. Part one, I will play Oliver Lake loud. For Colored Girls probably introduced a number of readers, certainly a teenage Farah Griffin, and spectators to Oliver Lake. I will play Oliver Lake loud, says the lady in blue in Shange's choreo poem for colored girls who've considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. I will play Oliver Lake loud stands out as a statement of defiance, one of the poem's few, second only to I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely. Many of us have wondered, who is this Oliver Lake? What does his music sound like? Why does it make the lady in blue so assertive, so defiant? Other musical figures populate for colored girls: Willie Colon, Archie Shepp, Eddie Palmieri, Charles Mingus. The club Slugs even makes an appearance. That same lady in blue, disappointed that Willie Colon is not performing, instead discovers Archie Shepp and says, if Jesus couldn't play a horn like Shepp, wasn't no need for colored folks to bear no cross at all. Along with Jane Cortez, Toni K. Bambara, and others, Shange introduced to literature Black women who were creative, multilingual, bohemian, literate, hip to avant-garde jazz and Latin music, and they were political as well. These women, theirs were women who emerged from an encounter of the Black arts movement with feminism, and the new music, a post-John Coltrane free jazz, was central to the rhythm, sound, and settings of the work these artists produce. In Shange's work, music is everywhere. References to music appear throughout the poem. Jazz musicians, literal and fictional, appear as characters. The language of her poetry and prose is itself musical, always attentive to sound. Throughout her career, Shange has frequently performed with other musicians. Oliver Lake is a frequent collaborator, as is David Murray, with whom she recently recorded Wildflower. Though most often spoken of as part of a multicultural group of artists and feminists from the Bay Area, where For Colored Girls was first developed, Shange's experience in the New York scene was especially influential as well, especially the Lower East Side and the emerging loft scene. Producer, director, choreographer Aku Kadogo was part of an original cast of For Colored Girls, and she recalled, quote, when I met Ntozake, it was Ntozake, Paula Moss, myself, and a woman called Kirsten. And I was actually working as a dancer with Ntozake. We did a lot of improvisation. We would go to the bars. Ntozake would read and we would dance, and the musicians would join and play with us. The loft scene was coming. The art ensemble was there. There was so much going on, end quote. So Shange was a part of a generation of avant-garde Black artists who were pushing boundaries, who were creating new vocabularies and new communities. This scene was a generative one and is both source and setting for much of her work. And as with Toni K. Bambara, Allison Mills, and Shirley Ann Williams, Shange addresses the peculiar bond some Black women found themselves in during this period, particularly those who were part of artistic communities. They would confront images of Black women as materialistic and bourgeois, unwilling to support the artistic aspirations of Black men, while at the same time struggling against the pressure to accept Black male patriarchy. These women gave us Black women characters who are appreciative of and concerned about the music. The women who frequent the jazz club as supporters of the music, if not lovers of the musicians, all seem primarily concerned with what Hortense Spillers calls the intramural relations between Black people, mothers and daughters, men and women, women friends and women lovers. While first readings reveal the gender conflict represented by the women writers of the 70s, interestingly, jazz is often, but not always, the commonplace, the meeting ground, the space of genuine communication between Black men and women. And while male musicians often in these works speak in tongues, it is the woman writer who has the gift of interpretation. In her first novel, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, Shange presents women who are not only the lovers or wives of jazz musicians, but who are artists in their own right. And this is true of Liliane, the novel Liliane, where Liliane is a visual artist. Sassafras, the weaver, live-in lover of Mitch, an avant-garde jazz saxophonist and heroin addict. Her sister Cypress, a dancer who marries the very successful musician Leroy McCullough, whose horns and arms, quote, had offered her horizons where she was free to see what she chose, feel what she had to, be what she dreamed, end quote. Here, the musician, dancer, male, female artist relationship is not one of rivalry, jealousy, or insecurity. It is one which enables Cypress's own creative journey and risk-taking. But for our purposes, it is that haunting, dominant Indigo who serves as the representative of Shange's own understanding of the music and its political implications. Through Indigo, Shange posits a theory of Black music, indeed of all Black art, one that is clearly informed by the Black aesthetic, but as is the case with much of Shange's work, with Indigo, the Black aesthetic here meets feminism. For the priest-like musician of the Black arts movement in this novel is female. In fact, she's a girl. If For Colored Girls opens with the plea that the poets sing a Black girl song, Indigo plays her own song, and in so doing, she plays the song of her ancestors and creates a pathway for the yet-to-be-born, whom as midwife she will later usher into the world. Part 3. Sound falls around me like rain on other folks. Ntozake Shange, I live in music. The magic child, Indigo, she with the moon in her mouth, is a consort of the spirits. She learns how to allow them to speak to and through her, especially through her music making. She is a fiddler. And when her Uncle John makes Indigo a gift of a fiddle, he tells her, when the slaves was ourselves and we couldn't talk free or walk free, who you think be doing our talking for us? And his answer to us is a poem, words made music. Quote, them whites that owned slaves took everything and was ourselves and didn't even keep it for their own selves, just threw it away, you hear? Took them drums what they could, but they couldn't take our feet. Took them languages that we speak. Took off with our spirits and left us with their son, but the fiddle was the talking one. The fiddle be calling our gods what left us, be giving back some devilment and hope in our bodies, worn down and lonely over these fields and kitchens. Why white folks so dumb, they was thinking that we didn't have nothing of our own, they could come controlling, meddling, whipping our sense out of us. But the colored smart, you see. The colored got some wits to 'em, you and me. We ain't the onlyest ones be talking to the unreal. What you think music is? What you think the blues be? And them get happy church musics is about, but talking with the unreal, what's more real than most folks ever gonna know, end quote. The internal rhyme here, linking feet and speak, the attempt to eliminate both physical mobility and language, the rhyme of colored smart, you see, colored got wits to 'em, you and me, linking he and Indigo to the enslaved ancestors, son and one, another internal rhyme. The access to the divine in Christianity is through the Son, the figure of Christ, but through the enslaved, the access to the divine is the fiddle, for the fiddle is the one. It provides the access. The music speaks the unspoken, speaks what the enslaved could not say, the reality of their existence and an expression of their longing and their aspirations. So Indigo learns first to let the fiddle speak her own concerns. Quote, whenever she wanted to pray, she let her fiddle talk. When she was angry, here came that fiddle. All the different ways of handling a violin and bow came to Indigo as she needed, end quote. Eventually, the community listens, and they say, too much of the Holy Ghost came out of Indigo and that fiddle. She is too involved with the spirit world and in the misery and weightiness of her people's history, fearing that she was, quote, dwelling on the dangerous misery of the slaves who were ourselves, end quote. Uncle John sends her, quote, toward the beauty of this world and the joys who came before, end quote. So like Abby Lincoln, Indigo learns to listen to the sparrows and the wrens, and she mimics, quote, the jays and the peckers. Music lets her converse with nature, and nature takes her to the realms of the spirit. And Shange tells us, quote, that no creature that moved escaped Indigo's attention. If the fiddle talked, it also rumbled, called, rustled, screamed, sighed, sirened, giggled, stomped, and sneered. Before long, Indigo acquires an entire vocabulary of sound. And before long, she can look at those around her, put her soul in theirs, and pull out, quote, the most lovely moment in their lives and play that. You could tell from looking that as Indigo let notes fly from the fiddle, that man's scar wasn't quite so ugly. The slaves who were ourselves aided Indigo's mission, connecting soul and song, experience and unremembered rhythms, end quote. Although she uses the fiddle to express her feelings, to commune with the ancestors, to play what she hears in the natural world, and ultimately to lend beauty and healing, though she plays from her heart, her mother and the extended family of her community just let her be, even as they cringe sometimes at what she plays. The teachers she needs find her. There is Pretty Man, who sends his woman Mabel to buy records for the magic girl child. Bartok Violin Concerto No. 2, Ray Nance, Stefan Grappelli, Anne Bach. Pretty Man tells her to listen closely and then play what she hears. Through Indigo, Shange gives us a pedagogy for the musically gifted child. Play free and consort with the spirits. Play from the heart. Converse with the birds. Play what you hear in the natural world, but also what you see. Listen to the masters and learn to play by ear. And this is actually a pedagogy, a kind of traditional Black music pedagogy, a way of learning Black music. Eventually, Pretty Man, quote, called everything from Bach to Ellington inside of one tune, and the girl fiddler rises to the occasion. Through Indigo, Shange reminds us of the centrality of Black music to Black aspirations for freedom. Furthermore, she insists that the artist must commune with the ancestral spirits but cannot remain among them. They must also engage the transcendent beauty of the natural world and the tradition of their instrument. Finally, Shange demonstrates the necessity of the discipline and of practice. Through Indigo, Shange sends musically curious readers on a quest for the fiddle and for fiddlers. Historically, we've lost a sense of the centrality of this string instrument to African American culture. Certainly, string instruments were significant in early jazz, but even before that, many of the enslaved played the fiddle. In fact, Miles Davis came from a line of enslaved string musicians on his father's side. Advertisements for runaway slaves often indicate that many of them were fiddlers, this connection between fiddlers and the desire for freedom, right, the quest for freedom. There is a mention in the WPA slave narratives of a runaway, a fugitive, a fiddler, who lived in a cave near one plantation and who would come out and play for his enslaved brothers and sisters at their dances, like the character John says, giving them back devilment and hope in their worn down bodies. In turn, the community of enslaved would provide him with food. So there is a relationship between these musicians, these fiddlers, and a love and quest for freedom that seems to have characterized a great many of them. Such a quest might yield extraordinary finds if you go looking. A Regina Carter, a Akua Dixon, Marlene Rice, John Blake, the late Billy Bang, Quartet Indigo, Uptown String Quartet. Here dwells the freedom-loving, freedom-singing notes of Indigo and the fugitive fiddlers of long ago. In another context, Shange writes of the late Billy Bang, quote, the energy he is able to generate in this instrument that has struggled so hard for its voice in the jazz arena is startling, unnerving, and reassuring simultaneously. Part 4. I stopped looking for roots and heroes and heroines, and I found my peers. Ntozake Shange, lost in language and in sound. In Shange's work, music serves as the conduit for spiritual and political longings. The notes fly free. The music invokes the ancestors, provides a map, a route, a way out, but also a meditative way into the self. Through her oeuvre, music Indeed, all of Black art, from Bearden's collages to Diane McIntyre's choreography, has this power. This is also the power of Shange's literature. The sheer beauty, seriousness, playfulness, the momentum and mobility of her writing does the same thing, honors the ancestors by acknowledging their suffering and their beauty, and dares to imagine freedom for her own and future generations. But freedom and the music are not only parts of the plot, not only the content, they provide the basis of the form as well. While much has been written about the jazz structure of a novel like Morrison's Jazz or Ellison's Invisible Man, few have looked to the formal qualities of Shange's prose for the structures most often associated with the music. And I'll say her poetry has been read in this way, but less so the prose. In the time that remains, very briefly, I want to turn to these formal qualities of Shange's writing. Quote, "It was all interconnected. I listened to the music and hear what they were saying at the same time, so I was always integrating the two things. I'd do my homework, writing things, listening to Cuban rhythms and Brazilian rhythms. I think that accounts for some of my ability to work musically with language," end quote. There are three elements of Shange's writing worth considering in this regard: the look of the words on the page, the spelling and the syntax, and the rhythm. The experience of reading Shange's work, be it poetry or prose, is always rhythmic, dance-like. Significantly, for one of the writers who would become the face of Black feminism in the late 70s and early 80s, Shange always claims Baraka and Ishmael Reed among her biggest literary influences. Known for her lowercase letters, slashes, she has attributed this to the influence of Baraka's The System of Dante's Hell or Ishmael Reed's Yellow Book Radio. Their syntax and structure, I should say, not their content. She says she selects lowercase letters because she likes, quote, "the idea that letters dance, not just that words dance," end quote. The look on the page is also an effort to make her reading of her own work more interesting, while at the same time more challenging for those of us who read the work. We have to engage it. We have to move with it, even as we are moved along by it. Simply on the visual level, the way the words look on the page, Shange's writing dances. She is known for so-called odd spelling, so that you becomes ya, with wit. She spells them as she hears them. As the persona or the character speaks to her, she hears the musicality of her speech, and she has to invent a notation system to represent them. Just as the sounds of Black music have not always fit within the Western musical system of notation, the English language, the King's English, the words available to her cannot always represent the sounds of the spoken word, nor their full meaning. From the look which influences the way we read the line, to the spelling and the phonetic, add the rhythm underneath. To read Shange's work is a rhythmic and lyrical experience. Shange doesn't seem to privilege music making over writing. Instead, she sees them as part of the same process, a process grounded in rhythm, of attending to the notes and the sounds of the spoken word. In one poem, she even includes time signatures and opens each stanza with a treble or bass clef. If Shange listens to music as she writes, I listen to music as I read her. At first, she gave me a list for listening, going out and finding all the artists to whom she refers. But as a reader who became fanatically engaged in the process, I end up asking, what might Indigo have sounded like had she grown up to play the violin? And upon each reading, I hear her, both Indigo and Ntozake Shange, anew. Thank you.
So my brother taught me how to read recipe books just for the fun of it. And that term, food porn and the rise of food studies, which of course, so much of Black culture has been at the vanguard, actually, of thinking about food and nourishment, sustenance, both musically and certainly in Shange's work. I didn't want to think about it as necessarily a negative kind of a thing. I mean, I think there is the erotic, but I was thinking about that it really is analogous to all the other actions that happen. It was more of a sort of an aside and not necessarily to bring up that feminist debate around that, but to think about, the sensuality, the ways in which it has to do with the body, even though some people would say like porn is about scopophilia and other kinds of things. I was thinking of it more in terms of its sort of colloquial understanding of it as the way in which food engages the body when we think about it. Yeah, I mean, there's a larger politics to it, but sometimes I think what is happening is that people, we don't really want to value the body, or those kinds of actions of sensuality, of sex even, which I was really struck last night by Shange's discussion of the poem, and it's there in her work in so many ways of both brutality, but also beauty and actual connection, so that I was trying to get at this idea of it's not visceral. That it's visceral and not always just metaphoric, right? And that there's a kind of a loop between these things in terms of performativity that literally touches us. And it's hard, right? Language doesn't capture it all. It approximates, and yet it too is material. So just trying to pay attention to all those different forms and really using a term that would get more at the touch.
I've conversed with a number of you earlier today about thinking about the relationship or the relevance or necessity of Ms. Shange's work now and in the past. So in the moment in which it was created for colored girls, or even Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, which is what, 1982? And then it's kind of partly because of the film, but also if we just not think about the film. But if we think about, how For Colored Girls is relevant today. Do you guys want to talk about the kind of the ways in which that text in particular is a present text for us?
It's funny. I think that is this on? Yeah. That there are really strong texts have many lives, and that they are shaped by the moment that they appear, but they also shape that moment, and that's what I think of for Colored Girls, is so much of, on the one hand, a text of the moment, but one that also shaped that moment, all the kind of controversies about it, and what I find interesting is the ways that readers over the decades, especially young women in college, but readers rediscover it, and that it continues to speak to them in their particular moments, particularly like that last poem, I Found God in Myself and I Loved Her. The notion of referring to oneself as a colored girl, and that not being a kind of restrictive thing, but something that you embrace as larger. And so I'm actually grateful for the movie because it brought it back, right? I think that there are people who had not seen it, generations of young women who didn't have the opportunity to perform it in college, or, Tyler Perry fans who would not have known it, and that it lives in this moment as well, right? So that it's a text that has many lives.
I just wanted to say my introduction to For Color Girls was On a Different World. I don't know if you remember on that series that Freddie, who was the hippie, the women of Gilbert Hall were going to celebrate blackness. And Whitley was saying, well, let's do something. And Freddie, who was the hippie, was like, no, I want to do For Colored Girls. And she was adamant about it. And they looked at her and they were like, yeah, okay. And they just dismissed it. And I thought, well, what is this work that Freddie, who's the hippie, who's the beatnik, who's the one and who's also the one who dismantles, right, the bourgeoisness and the upper classness of Whitley. What is this text?
I actually wanted to ask you to talk about the challenge of form, the challenge of the multiple forms that Zake's work demands of us in terms of teaching it, and it demands of us in terms of talking about it. Because I'm so struck by the different choices of form that you've decided to present in, including, we can go back to last night, the choices of form that, to do this conference has been challenging, right? To actually allow for so many different ways of engaging Zake that Zake demands of us. So I'd love to hear you all talk about, you're different, because there's a different way to enter and a different way to allow yourself to engage that's demanded of you.
Yeah, I would say the form is ritual. The form that I'm thinking through is ritual. And I think that when I think about accountability to the legacy of the healing work that Ntozake Shange created a space for, certainly with the choreo poem for colored girls, and also in the novels, and also in the poems themselves, I think about what does it take to create that space? Like, what would it take to create that space here, in a place where I have history and you have anxiety, and whatever we all have in this space. What's the ritual for this morning, or for the very tense task of being the first person on this panel, which includes my own mentors and teachers. So, a ritual that even allows me to be able to speak to Ntozake Shange's work in front of the artists and all of you, right? But I think about that also in relationship to that earlier question about what is the relevance, because I feel accountable to the legacy of asking that question. What does it mean to create a space for that healing? What does it take to create a space for that healing? And so for me, the question of this morning was, well, what is the ritual that allows this even to happen? But also, what is the way to do the ritual while also then describing the rituals that we do in Durham that's present to the rituals, the referent rituals in the text, in particular Indigo's rituals, right? So for me, there's something important about that. And I think that as the art emerges in different forms, what I look for is, how is that happening, right? Like, how are the dancers calling in the energy and making that space for truth-telling and transformation that I understand to be the structure of the ritual that I learned from Ntozake Shange? And how do I make sure that I myself am doing that? And how is it that we each did that, which I think, in fact, we did. And we're such a telepathic ensemble, I don't even know. It reaffirms my faith. But yeah, that's how I think about it. Ritual transforms. And so what is the transformation, and what makes it possible in a particular moment, in a particular space?
I think for myself, what's interesting is, in this gathering, we see the multiplicity of Shange's work. And so you need to have the person who does performance, the person who does ritual, the person who does, right? All of these things. And yet, what this gathering highlights is that we're still tapping into that truth, right? And that goes back to the relevance. What is the relevance of her, what is the relevance of her work? The relevance of it being that it is constructed in truth, right? And that's what responds to our spirits. That's what makes our spirits jump up out of our bodies and go, oh, this text. And that's what every subsequent generation responds to. It's, oh, right, and we see ourselves somehow in this text. And I think, yes, for myself, it was the consciousness of my first entree. When I read Shange's work, I always notice the Spanish. What is this doing here? And I've written about that, about her inclusion not only of Spanish language, but also Spanish music, or Latin, Hispanic musicians, and broader cultural manifestations. And then for myself, that goes, right, because I am a woman of Caribbean descent born in New York City, meaning that for me, there are things that aren't foreign. I can have bagel and lox, and I can have mac and cheese and collard greens, and I have a right to all of those things because I was born here. And that multiplicity is what I responded to. I go, right. Depending on who looks at me, they determine who I am. They think of who I am based on where they're from. So when I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 7 years, I was a light-skinned mulatto. When I'm in Puerto Rico, I am Puerto Rican. When I'm in Brazil, I'm Brazilian, right. And all of those things in some way are true to those who are watching me, and to myself, and to the ancestors that walk with me. So that's what I think of like the multiplicity of forms, and how we live in a culture that demands or tries to restrict and impose, in the guise of simplicity, uniformity. And what her work does is say, no, we are complex, and we are all of these things, and we can honor that, and that is the truth.
I concur.
I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the panel. Alexis, thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Your cousin.
As I was listening to everyone speak, a couple things jumped out at me. The first being, I'm a father. I have twin 10-month-old daughters.
Oh my goodness.
And so I'm listening to you speak about how women are discovering themselves or rediscovering themselves. I also grasped onto two other points, and I'll ask my question. One being the active interaction with the text, rituals, recipes, the dance, the music. The second being how the text lives through generations. And so when I think about Bria and Brielle, my daughters, and my responsibility to raise them, what prescriptions, and I'd like to hear as many of you who want to address this as possible, what prescriptions are alive in this text for them to discover who they are as girls, women?
Yeah, I'm going to pass on that question since I'm going to just be telling you how to raise your daughters for the rest of our lives.
Anybody else?
Just never underestimate the role of the aunt.
No kidding.
Auntie subject.
I mean, I can say one thing. I have been, I'm not supposed to jump in maybe, but I'm going to do it. Sorry. This year, the faculty, we've put together a faculty group that's been reading Shange's work all year long as well, a multidisciplinary group of faculty who voluntarily go to a meeting in which we've been experiencing Shange's work. And I have to say that it's been really, I have a daughter who's 3 years old. It's been really, those conversations have been really transformative in terms of thinking about, whatever rituals I might need that I didn't have, or that I had in a different form, right? Or what kinds of knowledges or literacies, literally, I would like for my daughter to have. And Alexis said something to me earlier today about, her mother, when you were 14, just handed you for Colored Girls and said, this is important, right? Didn't tell her how to read it, right? I mean, this is you also figuring out from a different world, right? That you knew that was important because they were fighting about it, right? So, I mean, in some ways, I think what you want to do is make things available and don't dictate how they're used, right? I mean, one of the things that seems so important about Shange's work is the multiple modes of entry and multiple uses that those different ways of getting in there make it possible. And I think, I've even had very different experiences of the same Shange work as I've read them, but not even over the years. I'm talking like last summer and then October, right? I mean, it's like, so I do think that, one of the beauties of the work is multiple engagements in the same piece and then over time and space and geography. So I would just say, just be conscious of making things available, and you can buy up a bunch of stuff out there and just have it ready. Because I mean that's what I'm going to do, right? So, I mean, there's a kind of practical element, but then also a kind of philosophical element of just making. I mean, it's information, actually.
I would add to that. I agree. Like just having books around. I think about all the things that I discovered on my own just because they were in the house. And in this case, we're really fortunate because there's some children's books too.
Yeah,
which they're
exactly.
beautiful. They have, they're just fun and they're beautiful, and it's a good starting point, I think.
It's also really important. I just want to mention this. I mean, you asked a question about daughters, but I'm making those same books available to my son, which I think is, I just said to my husband the other day, it's like, I've considered myself a failure, right? I mean, if I'm not raising a feminist man, so I think, or a black feminist man, that's who I'm raising actually. So I mean, I do think it's important to have things available and not put any restrictions again on interaction, use, entry. I think that's really important.
I think also, I want to commend you for even asking that question, and the fact that that is a thought in your brain, that you are actively parenting these girls, and that you are honoring your role as their father. Because off the bat, that in and of itself is a sacred position.
Participatory engagement with Shange's text. And I guess I want to hear from you guys how teaching Shange has changed your pedagogy. Because it's changed mine, and I'm teaching a course based on this next spring. So I want to get some tips from you now while I got you trapped here.
I'll say this, I've learned to be careful, like if I'm teaching Shange in a course with other writers, because the students fall in love with the Shange text, right? And so I feel like I now place it more at the end than in the beginning because nobody else excites them as much in the same way. And then I can think of a number of papers and dissertations even that have grown out of someone's first encounter with Ms. Shange's work, which is just extraordinary. It's so inspiring in that way. But I think it's her work has forced me as a teacher to be, I always consider myself interdisciplinary. I think I'm interdisciplinary, but it makes me have to be more interdisciplinary and to really be able to understand even just the references. Who are these people? And what is this aesthetic that she's giving as a gift to us, so that I feel like it's both made me grow as a thinker, scholar, writer, and then a better teacher because of the work that I have to do in order to share it with them. But the students just fall in love with it very quickly. Yeah.
That's also a reason, though, I think that it could be collaborative. And, I thought about actually playing some music, doing more with dance, but you really need a collective to bring it to its full realization. And I think that that's one of the really wonderful things, and I'm so happy that now I am in a Department of Theater and Performance Studies where I have students who perform the work and make it their own. The other thing I've done is shown different versions of, for example, for colored girls, although I teach a whole range of her work. And that was really instructive, and there was like a PBS version in the 80s, and both of them added men, which is something that also happened with the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so thinking about, for me, and I know there's been a whole panel on it with, Professor Colbert and with Shange herself in the fall about the film version, but questions to ask are, how much that changed it. And it's not that you can't translate things from one to the other. Look at, again, the illustration of Shange's work of, making music on the page, and I really took your point to heart, Farah, about that it's not just, right, the sound, but it's also the sound of her own poetry that is musical, which, and so the decisions and the kind of choices made in that film, I thought were really flattened out and changed the spirit of what the original form was of the choreopoem, which, again, is something that requires voice, movement, sound, audience, and is a much more collaborative ensemble sense, also like jazz too. So I think it helps us to do that, to say there's not one interpretation.
And actually, what you remind me of is I emphasize, I've taught Shange's work in a literary context. They have to read out loud, and like on a very basic level, like I ask my students to always read ahead of time, right? Come to class prepared to speak. But they read out loud. And oftentimes what I find is that they, in responding to the text, they go, oh, wait, and they find it and they read it out loud. And then what it does also is makes them aware of things that they have forgotten, maybe perhaps in their family lore. And so I had to be really clear about my objective when I was teaching. So for example, in one context, I was just happy that they were introduced to her work. So whatever they reacted, we would go with it. In another context, it was being very, very clear about how they think about themselves and how they may see themselves reflected in literature. And so, what resulted was a larger discussion of how we, at any given moment, cut parts of ourselves away, hide parts of ourselves away. So for example, on Twitter, we might talk about scandal, but we might not talk about, the Real Housewives of Atlanta, or the Real Housewives of Miami, or whatever, because it's like, well, this is acceptable, but this isn't. right? And so that discourse of acceptability and what we choose to hide and what we don't, and what is wrong with bringing everything to light and saying, no, this is who I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the powerful things is just the way that Shange's work makes form visible, and how it can make the form of the classroom visible, even to the, and then even seem inadequate, of course, right? And like what the forms of sitting and what the forms of silence, the forms of facing one direction, whatever those forms might look like. I think that it's a powerful approach to let the transformational work of her work with form, your work with form, shift that, right? And like require different relationships to the physical space and other spaces. I mean, I ended up having, daring my students to perform their own poetry on the campus bus that goes around Duke, as part of their enactment, and they did it, and then they loved it, and they wanted to do it again, and they wanted to like film themselves on their phone while they did it, and it was very interesting because it inspired them to transform the space and to see the people sitting on the bus taking out their earbuds or whatever and engaging differently. Felt like a certain tribute to the work and a certain rigor with the work to see how does it transform a space that it comes into. How does it transform this space?
Good afternoon. Thank y'all. I really enjoyed hearing what I did here. And I have a question, a comment / question about ritual poetics on the stage and in theater. I have the opportunity and the blessing to work with the Black Women's Performance Ensemble that sees Shange's work as a genesis, as a theoretical genesis, as a spiritual genesis for how we do our work together, whether that is for larger performances for people or the performance of sisterhood and sisterhood building. So I would like to hear from anyone who could talk a little bit more about critical use of ritual poetics that's linked to sustaining sisterhood, linked to sustaining other ensemble forms and formations that are invested in the liberation of Black girls and women.
I can speak to that first. Full transparency, this is my sister, Ebony Noel Golden, my chosen sister, who we've been learning to practice sisterhood together now for a very long time, also in previous lifetimes. And we had the opportunity to collaborate on the transformative, performative aspect of a coalition called Ubuntu, which is dedicated to ending gendered violence and creating sustaining transformative love. And so we drew specifically on Shange's work in terms of being able to try to create space in our community to talk about ending gendered violence, and specifically in the context of the Duke lacrosse rape scandal. We were trying to have this conversation and make space in our bodies and in our communities to do this work. So Shange's work was one of the most major resources for our collaborations. We were co-chairs of that initiative. So full disclosure, we know each other. And so Body Ecology, the performance ensemble that Ebony refers to, that I also referred to as the folks who came for Indigo Days, the ritual that we had for the Black warrior healers that gathered in Durham, is for me the best example, is the best answer to the question. Personally, I feel like you should just tell us what that is, and everyone in the room should learn from that, but I'm biased. But I will just repeat that I do think that there's not only, and we can talk later, and I'm going to give you my paper and stuff about the stuff going on with the Indigo After School and Indigo Journeys and the Indigo Night School in Durham, since you left us and moved to New York. But I'll say, not to be repetitive for other folks, I think that there's a ritual poetics to what we do and what we repeat doing, and what we do on a regular basis, meaning ritual, and when we stop. Like how repetition is sacred in a ritual poetics and not arbitrary. And so what that makes me want to say in terms of form, especially in this institutional space, is that there's a way that something like the standardized form of something like an after-school program, for example, would be repetitive in some ways that are useful and that provide stability, and then it would also just be repetitive in some ways that are probably redundant or maybe just convenient or maybe not accountable or maybe just have to do with a lack of creativity or maybe enforce a lack of evolution, maybe. And I think it's interesting to think about the rituals that we take on and then the way that we allow ourselves to not do the same thing over and over again and then to grow, or for these folks to move from 6th grade and doing a twice-a-week after-school program to then move to 7th grade and to say, now we're taking it on the road, right, in this Indigo Journeys type of way. But I want to say that a function of ritual poetics and that ritual practice of creating the poetic space to engage each other, I feel that it is evolutionary. And I feel like it does require us in our ensembles, in the spaces that we move in the projects that we even create, to allow ourselves to be transformed by the need for the work in this moment. And again, I'm saying this more to y'all because you have taught me this, but we were talking earlier today about the relationship to tradition in Shange's work, and thinking about that engine of that process that says we want to have everything. We want to have all the tools, we want the words, we want the notes, like we want the instruments, we want the fiddle, like we want all of those tools that connect us to our multitude and our crew, living and dead, all of our folks that connect to us. So the use of tradition is a matrix in that way. But what we're confronting, we define what we're confronting as something that is new, right? The colored children are a manifestation of the 20th, but now 21st century, is that way that there's also a break and a breakthrough, and the improvisation asks for using all of these things that we have gathered and gathering them together. I loved the description last night about repeating the form and repeating the form and repeating the form until that moment where you can catapult, right? And like that accumulative process of repeating and repeating and repeating, and how does it allow us to fly through the air to where we didn't know we could go, which is the function of the creative process for us. That's what I think about. I think about how can we challenge ourselves to think about when we're doing the same thing, why it's valuable to be doing that same thing over and over again, and then not forget that the whole point of that repetition was for the breakthrough.
Okay. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to end our first session. I invite you all to come back at 2 o'clock for the next panel.